But talking about selling federal land to solve the housing supply side is just asinine. True or false?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd say in reaction to that is I hear you, and I don't think...
Are you my therapist, John?
Well, I guess
one.
I'd say I'm not taking point of view.
Yeah.
You talk about it privately, we talk about it publicly. This is the Real Estate Insiders Unfiltered Podcast. Welcome again to the Real Estate Insiders Unfiltered Podcast. I'm your host, Dwiggy, along with crazy Uncle Keith.
Yes.
We had John Duncan, who's a principal and co-founder at Meridian Research, and you saw him on a podcast with Ivy Zellman.
Yeah, I did.
Tell the viewers and listeners, this guy is like one of the most knowledgeable people in D.C.
Really super genius about politics, policy, and how it can influence and impact real estate. Guy's been in D.C. since the Newt Gingrich era. For those of you kids listening at home, that was a long damn time ago. He's been in cabinets for multiple administrations, actually on multiple sides of the aisle, I think. Yeah. He's got a great answer to who he would have lunch with. We asked him questions like, is now crazier than ever in D.C.? You'll want to hear that answer. What are some plans federally for the supply side problem of residential real estate? His thoughts on the Road to Housing Act of 2025 and some of the nuances in there, changes to the credit report and how we might have more people becoming first-time homebuyers in the not too distant future, and a whole lot more. This was dense. It was chunky. It's one you might want to listen to twice because we are cranking through a lot of thoughtful information in a very short period of time. You're going to get smarter from this one, kids. Put it in your ears.
John, welcome to the podcast. We are excited. I know Keith is because he got to see you in person.
Ivy Zellman did a podcast with you, and I was like, ooh, man, I got to try to get him for the pod. Stuff. And John foolishly said yes. So here we go. We've got him. Awesome. It was a great conversation that you had with Ivy, and we're hoping to replicate it here. So thanks for joining us.
We've had Ivy on the pod now a couple of times, and everybody who always listens to her and watches her is just like their minds explode on the stuff.
She's great. She's been an old friend, and I guess you could say we've been around the block together. We sort of met in the depths of the credit crisis, so it's been.
That's funny. That's how James and I met.
That's literally how we met.
Exactly how we met, and here we are.
John, so give us a little bit about your background, especially in analyzing policy. So It's kind of a speed round on your background, what you do now, and your journey to getting where you are. For the viewers and listeners. Well,
first of all, thanks again for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun and definitely some interesting topics. Quite active these days. So I got my start in Washington D.C. in the policymaking world, working for Newt Gingrich. In his sort of initial rise to power, was lucky I had an opportunity to manage his campaign in 1994, which is a sort of a historic era of congressional politics, and then worked in the Speaker's office in a consequential time where we were passing the contract with America on a bunch of important reforms across policymaking. And I think, one thing that I gained from that experience in my subsequent time in the Bush administration, where I worked for two different cabinet secretaries, is just sort of a recognition about the holistic nature of policymaking. You can kind of hear an individual, member of Congress or even somebody important in the executive branch say something, express a point of view, but you're really not going to have a good sense of sort of how to think about the likely outcome unless you're sort of taking a holistic look at the policy ecosystem, different individuals, campaign level, stakeholder level. So I think I learned a lot of that from, my time both with Newton and in the Bush administration. Spent a little bit of time in the private sector. Well, actually, it's about a 7-year hiatus in the tech and venture world. So, allowed me kind of developed a little bit more of a dispassionate view of thinking about Washington and using data and kind of in an objective fashion to assess outcomes, which as watching people talk about Washington every day, that a lot of times sort of passion for the issues can kind of get in the way of kind of a sober view of what's likely to happen. So I think I was able to kind of develop that perspective by spending some time away. And then, I'd say I've been very fortunate since 2007 doing work as an analyst in Washington, largely for the investor community. So we work with many of the world's leading investment management firms to help them understand what's likely to happen on macro policy issues like tax, fiscal, trade, sanctions, individual sectors, expansively, could be as far-flung as healthcare or energy policy. And housing has really always been a central issue for us because, as I was noting, we kind of had our birth in the midst of the global financial crisis. And just housing has been a central issue, not just for investors, but housing is a really sort of central issue for policymakers, not just the discontinuities from the credit crisis, but also just, these days, the cost of housing. It's causing people to,
it's a huge problem,
focus on what can we do about housing, but it's also causing a lot of discontent about people's lives generally that's having ancillary effects on policymaking. So,
it's interesting. I made a post on social media the other day, and I've been including it in keynotes I do around the country. And this stat, I just can't get over this particular stat. So 9% of single family homeowners today are spending 50% of their mortgage payment on insurance and property taxes. It was 4% in 2014.
Interesting.
And it's really related to, and I posted a picture of on Watch Duty, which is a fire app. The Western US is on fire in case anybody hasn't seen. And just the amount of problems that we're dealing with, not just the cost of housing, but people are not talking about some of these ancillary issues like homeowners insurance is a real big problem that's getting bigger by the year, to where people just can't even afford to get a house because they can't afford the insurance on the damn thing. So I know we'll get into some of this stuff, but like the policies of what we're doing and how we're approaching these things are not, in my opinion, being talked about enough for the real issues that consumers are facing, on a day-to-day basis. We talk about interest rates, where there's a lot of other factors in this process too.
Yeah, one thing on that stat though, James, is boomers have been paying off or paying down their homes, and so I think you got a huge cohort that I think is skewing that number up. I'm not saying insurance isn't a problem. I'm saying for that specific stat, you have a huge cohort of people who have no mortgage payment or a very low mortgage payment. And so as costs for insurance have gone up, that skews that number. Doesn't dismiss at all the fact that insurance is a real issue for first-time home buyers, and we got to find a solution for that.
It's not just first-time home buyers; it's an issue for everybody. I mean, the comments section in that pod was there wasn't even people in like Minnesota were like hasn't gone up 40% in the past few years. So the point is, there's just a lot of these issues, and I posted like what is happening both, which we know is much more of a state issue than federally, but there's these things are getting to be broader problems around. But we'll dive into that.
John, I have a background question.
Yeah, sure.
Because I usually do. So dispassionate and Washington, D.C. You said those two things in the same sentence, and those basically go together like peanut butter and Worcestershire sauce or something. Like, I don't know what. What you stepped away. I'm curious, as someone who is somewhat apolitical. Like I don't enjoy politics, so I tend to stay away from it. As someone who stepped out and now is sort of out but in and looking at it, how did your view change, or did it in that experience where you've sort of done those two different roles for a big chunk of time?
Sure. I mean, I guess it was just having that time away, sort of what opened the door for me to be able to play a role as an analyst. When you're in government, or, you're a consultant of some form, like a lobbyist, for example, your job is to represent and sell a point of view. And your perception of the world, exists around that point of view, or your perception of the policymaking world. And so I think the time away, sort of allowed me to just take a broader look and understand that, there's a broader set of factors that lead to outcomes here. So, developing that and having patience, frankly, it's also good for one's mental health. People sort of ask like, how do you stay sane dealing with these issues? But, when you're looking at it objectively, and you just don't get emotionally engaged, right? And it's much easier to be around it, because as we all kind of know, there's a lot of there's a lot of heartburn in policy these days, and sort of easy to become overwhelmed by that. But thankfully, I'm not in that mindset. So
yeah, it becomes a thought exercise and not a crusade. Right?
Exactly.
And those are different.
I wanted to ask you before we jump on, as it made me think of a question. You said you were there with Newt Gingrich. Was that, I've heard this time frame as the time frame where at that point in time still politicians would go have lunch with each other across the aisle and sit down and talk about things and try to find some middle ground. Is that true?
Like off camera, they would get stuff
done. They would like go have
Yeah.
lunch and be like, we got to figure this out. And they didn't hate each other as much as what it seems like they all hate each other today. Is that true?
I think that is true. I'm, trying to think of a good way to measure it, but certainly anecdotally, that's very, very much was the case then, and is not as much now. And I think, one of the contributors to that, is the fact that, we've the way that politics is really now dominated largely by forces that exist outside of Washington. With the proliferation of campaign money that exists outside of the parties. This is kind of a bit of an academic perspective, but I think maybe interesting. It has pulled power outside of D.C. Many different outside groups outside of the sort of internal institutions of politics are sort of driving outcomes in terms of financing the campaigns around getting people elected or advocating for issues. In addition to that, as we're seeing, throughout society, communications technology has also kind of pulled power out of the hands of centralized institutions. Maybe you see this, as leaders within industry, but it's certainly the case in politics that, Congress is in many ways, it's like the tail wagging the dog. It's the power in people's hands, being able to organize via social media, and be able to sort of channel their opinions that way, I think has really removed power from DC, and created a lot of the factionalism that you see. And one manifestation of that is really just that, decision making, coalition building, it's less about interpersonal relationships. It's more about kind of mass communications and marketing. That's what drives decision making.
Interesting.
Does that work?
All right.
Does that work? Well, I guess we'll find out over the next decade or so, right?
Yeah.
All right. Let's do the rapid fire. This one's selfish for me, and I'm excited for yours because I know you're a consumer of a lot of content via book and pod. So what's your favorite book, podcast? Where do you go, reread list or just one that means a lot to you?
Sure. Yeah. I'd say something that I would recommend is Conversations with Bill Kristol. It's a podcast. They're about, 45 minutes long. Bill Kristol, for those of you who aren't familiar, he's been sort of a longtime figure in politics for much of his life, a longtime figure in Republican politics, but he's, a pretty significant critic of President Trump. So he kind of comes more from that perspective more recently. But I mention it, not because of any particular political persuasion, but it's a really good 45-minute conversation, every other week with very thoughtful individuals. Some may be more from academia, some may be kind of influence in Washington, some may be, political professionals, pollsters, or people from a particular policy perspective. But yeah, it's a great, thoughtful podcast if you want to get a good, broad perspective, on issues impacting, policymaking.
And it
lowers your blood. And it lowers your blood pressure, right? Like it's a good podcast.
He talks very calmly.
Good. It's not the sham wow of political podcast. Nice. Good. Good.
All right. So mine is, if you could have lunch with one person, current or historical, who would it be?
Well, I'll cheat just because I want to make sure to maintain my objectivity here, but I'd say JD Vance and AOC. And I say that because
great answer.
And there's great similarity, right? Because, they have both really put their finger on discontent, maybe from different perspectives and different parts of the population. But really both have recognized that, there's significant discontent in different parts of the U.S. population. And they've also really are quite thoughtful from differing perspectives on, how to try to address that from a policy standpoint. And I think one thing that's notable is that in both cases, housing affordability, has been a significant theme for both of them. So
yeah. First of all, I love that answer because and this is becoming rarer and rarer in this world. You want both sides of an argument at the lunch with you.
Mm-hmm.
You aren't trying to create an echo chamber.
I might actually have two different lunches. I don't know if I want to put them together.
Get them together. Like that's what we used to be able to disagree, right? We used to be able to go to lunch and talk and have a high clash of ideas and a low clash of egos. So make sure it's a private room, exactly. No media around. And I think it's refreshing that one would want to hear both sides as they form their opinion. Okay, absolutely. I got my first question.
Yep.
As I knew we were going to have you on. This one was special, and just for me as the person who has sort of thrown his hands up with politics in general and just said this is crazy. So, at a really high level, is this the craziest time you've ever seen in politics in D.C.?
I would say, in terms of volatility, in terms of sort of the agenda swinging dramatically from one direction to another, not just on a week to week basis, but on a year to year basis and election to election basis, it certainly is. And I think it kind of goes to two things, that are pretty big picture factors. One of which I kind of really already highlighted, but one is just dislocations in the economy, right? I mean, with the not just globalization, which gets a lot of press, but I think if you look at, talk to economists, really technology's been displacing labor in a rapid fashion since the 90s. And that's just accelerating. And it's not, it used to be one of the central factors, sort of in global politics is, and really because of the rise of conservatives you see because of, discontent among lower educated workers. But what's interesting is that now we're starting to see just the beginnings of dislocation among higher educated workers with the rise of AI, right? You see it right now in unemployment rates rising among recent college grads. So I think that phenomena is really causing a lot of discontent, which is driving volatility. And then kind of to my earlier point, just the proliferation of information channels. We're not all looking at the same information. It's harder for us to talk to each other. It's harder for us to have the same point of view because information's so segmented. And
inaccurate 90% of the time, by the way.
And we perceive the world very differently, right? And so that's just causing these massive swings in policy from one direction to another.
Interesting.
Well, I want to go on to this topic because, this is where you've had a lot of feedback on this. So let's talk about housing and specifically housing supply. There's obviously been a lot of policies that have come out and certainly some in the Big Beautiful Bill. I know that National Association of Realtors was heavily involved in influencing some of those policies. But can you talk to us about some of these things? How is this going to help with affordability? Can you unpack some of the details there for us? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the good news is that at least federal policymakers get it, that, housing supply, is really sort of one of the, if not the central, quote, problems, in the housing market, and constraints on supply. I think the bad news is, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but at a federal level, they can't provide all the answers, right? It's really an issue that exists, at the state and local level as well. So, but at least in terms of what federal policymakers have been talking about and considering, going back, sort of early Biden era, where this issue started to generate attention among policymakers, on the left, there's a lot of focus on price controls. And a focus on, industry not looking out for consumers. So this manifests itself in the multifamily space. I know we're talking about single family, but a lot in, focus on rent controls, constraining algorithmic pricing tools that were increasingly utilized in that sector. And then in the single family space, the answer from the left was, we need to get investors out of the market, and, private equity is, buying too much housing, and they're,
and that realtor commissions are too high.
Right.
Another
right.
one.
Yeah, exactly. And antitrust enforcement on realtor commissions. So those are kind of a lot of the answers from the left. Biden, I think, echoed some of that, but then, he also had a very thoughtful agenda, in this area. He proposed a number of things that thought Congress should do. Allocating more money at a $20 billion fund, modest in the overall scheme of things, but still something to build new affordable housing. There was a new incentive for developers of single family homes. The low income housing tax credit's a tax incentive for multifamily developers, but Biden had the idea of a neighborhood homes tax credit for single family developers. He had a bunch of executive actions, to try to use federal grant money as a leverage point to get states and localities to, streamline their zoning laws, and trying to get the GSEs more into financing, construction lending. So those are some of the ideas there. And I bring that up because obviously we're past the Biden era. But as we think about, kind of a bipartisan perspective here, I think some of those ideas are going to reemerge. Trump, has, and I should say also, because I know you want to probably get into it and you sort of alluded to it, but, Biden also focused a lot on trying to address high closing costs. And he had a variety of proposals there to reform and create more competition in credit scoring, to try to reduce the costs contributed from title insurance. Trump has adopted some of that in the sense that, he's sustained some of the closing cost initiatives. He has done some other additional things. He's focused on wanting to sell federal land and try to have federal land utilized for housing development. He has focused in a way that Biden didn't, I think, kind of natural from a partisan standpoint, on cutting regulations. At a federal level, there are still regulations that have impacts on housing supply, barriers to building near waterways, energy efficiency requirements. So his agenda is to try to streamline and cut back on that. Of course, another element of the Trump agenda that's not so friendly to housing supply is, both his tariff and immigration policy, right? Which both contribute to rising costs of building homes. So
we had the CEO and chief advocacy officer for the National Association of Home Builders on our pod. We'll put a link in the show notes, by the way, for viewers to go listen to it. And they were not keen on tariffs. Let's just leave it at that. For both,
immigration. Both were a problem.
Yeah, both were major points of contention for them from both the perspective of obviously, the cost for lumber and then labor, where they were very clear, like not good, so,
he gets that, I think, I think tariffs, he's got such an overwhelming focus on his tariff and his immigration agenda for broader purposes, but I think he recognizes the sensitivity that some industries have to these issues. So, for example, on a 50% tariff he put on copper, it was implemented in such a way that, it didn't have its full effect. And I think part of that was some input from the housing industry and sort of the cost effects there. On immigration, he you may have seen sort of made the point that, well, maybe we should have an exemption for hospitality and housing. But then, of course, the sort of tide of hawkishness was so significant there that even he got kind of beaten back by, his base, and they didn't make those exemptions. So it indicates that he sees some sensitivity in those areas. But I think the tide of focus is so significant in those two areas that, I think he's not going to be that selective about it.
I did a keynote in Beverly Hills a week ago. Keith, you actually find this fascinating. The association was there, and the GAD, the government affairs director, was talking about the rebuild of the different areas of Los Angeles that got hit by the wildfires in February. There's nothing's broken ground. Like nothing has broken ground still on any of those areas,
sorry to hear that.
et cetera. And it's just the point I was going to was federally, there's one thing, but this is such more, and Keith talks about this all the time, but this is such more about locality, and permitting and environmental laws. And it just, here we are, it's August and those people haven't even started to rebuild. They have to live through that nightmare every day.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can I double click on a couple on the federal side before we skip to state, but go ahead.
Well, I got a couple questions on some things that you mentioned. So I actually did some research for this pod.
Oh, wow.
I'd just like everyone to know that. Mostly because this whole institutional investors are buying up all the single family homes is a really common refrain in our world. And since we've got a genius analyst with us, I want to pick your brain on that topic a little bit. I did a little bit of research, and what I came up with is roughly 5% of all single family homes are owned by institutional investors. So 5% of the available housing inventory is off the market. Now that sounds bad. Don't get me wrong. 5% is a number, but 82% of single family rental homes are held by mom and pop investors, people who became accidental investors and maybe they only own a few. So to me, this, like, I get it. It is, if you want to bash billionaires or you want to bash really large companies like Blackstone, even though they call it BlackRock, it's fine, right? Like, I get it. But is it really true that the problem with the supply side that we have in this country is because of institutional investors? That's my question.
Well, I don't want to pick sides in any argument, but I guess I would point out that, aren't institutional investors just sort of a form of capital, flowing into housing supply, in the same way that like individual capital would flow into housing supply, right? So they're not taking these homes off the market and getting rid of them, the housing people in them, right? So I think it's just a different sources of capital. In that respect, it doesn't make intuitive sense to me as to how that would cause a constraint on housing supply. But, I guess.
And look, in 2001, housing supply was a different issue than it is in 2025, right? Like, inventory's doubled in the last 12 months. So, is the available homes for sale really what's driving this market? I don't know. I got one more double click and then you can unpack more federal stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, this one is just like my own little Don Quixote thing. I hear people talking about selling federal land, and I'm like, bro, that is not going to work. Has anyone called you bro lately, John? Probably not. But like, it's in the middle of nowhere. It has no infrastructure. If we started tomorrow, that my daughter who's 13 might be able to move into one of these neighborhoods that are put on federal land. Like, that is not a near term. I get it sounds sexy. The best part of that, in my humble opinion, is you'd get some cash in to help with the deficit, which might put downward pressure on rates, which would actually help a home buyer today. But talking about selling federal land to solve the housing supply side is just asinine. True or false?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd say in reaction to that is I hear you, and I don't think
Are you my therapist, John?
Well, I guess I'd say I'm not taking point of view. I'd say that while that is a sort of in classic Trump fashion, sort of something that's
bombastic statement,
easy to understand and it's easy to articulate, I would not say that stakeholders in the policy arena are really sort of touting that or advocating for that in some way that would suggest that it's a big part of the answer.
God, John, that is a much kinder way to say what I was trying to say.
Almost like you were in politics.
You're very good at what you do. All right, you had a little more on the federal stuff.
Well, I just didn't want to lose it just because I know it's an important, question.
Yeah, please.
But so we have these executive branch actions that Biden articulated, and we'll probably return to some of that stuff when, when Democrats have more of a say in things. Trump has taken more of a deregulatory approach as a central part of his answer. I would note, interestingly, that Congress is active on this subject. So in the big beautiful bill, as you noted, there's an expansion of low income housing tax credit. That was probably the most economically significant kind of element of what they did housing specific. But right now, you'll find this interesting. The Senate Banking Committee, which is chaired by Senator Scott, Republican from South Carolina, and the top Democrat is Senator Warren from Massachusetts. They collaborated together and passed a bill in the Banking Committee with unanimous support to address housing supply. So I think that's a really important data point to suggest that people on both sides of the aisle get it. But kind of to the earlier point, which I know you well recognize, there's just not a lot they can do about it, right? And so largely that bill, it's sort of everything in the kitchen sink, but it's limited to things like using HUD grant programs to incent more streamlined zoning, and land use, right? It's actually probably the most distinct impact is to do some things to facilitate more financing of manufactured housing. But otherwise, it's largely kind of FHA and HUD-based reforms, that try to get at the issue, but that's limited in the overall scheme of the market. But I guess that's the bad news. The good news is that bill is likely to get enacted into law this year, and it does sort of reflect the fact that policymakers on both sides of the aisle, kind of recognize the importance of this issue. Can we tell them also, just like, can we also make the politicians understand that consumer confidence is like a major factor in people wanting to buy and sell houses? Yeah.
I say this all the time. I'm not saying that those aren't issues, and I'm not saying that interest rates aren't an issue, but if people don't feel comfortable, they don't make big decisions.
Right. Yeah.
Like, I think that's actually one of the biggest things that people aren't talking enough about, is like consumer confidence is absolutely critical for people to decide they want to sell or buy a house.
Right. Right. And I'm sure the policy volatility is not helping with that.
It's not helping that.
Right.
And then the only other two things I'd note, just to kind of give you the complete picture of the federal policy discussion, is this area is, on the sort of mortgage finance side of things, there's some discussion about portability of mortgages, we have a lock-in effect where people have a low mortgage, as rates have gone up, they're reluctant to sell their homes and, because they don't want to incur higher mortgage costs. So, this is a feature of FHA and VA loans. But there's been some discussion about, applying it in the GSE space. Now, I think the probability of that happening, is probably limited, but just because the risk aversion, on the part of the GSEs and FHFA, but nevertheless, it is a discussion taking place. And then there's also monetary policy things like, trying to get the Fed to slow its runoff of MBS holdings. But that's kind of a background issue.
I have a question on the bill, and if this is too in the weeds, tell me.
Sure.
Okay. But the manufactured housing part, when I read about that, I found it interesting because historically, my residential real estate professional brain has always thought, okay, manufactured homes are cheaper, but but harder to finance and more expensive to finance, right? Because historically, manufactured home meant, I don't know, trailer or whatever to Fannie and Freddie, right? Versus two halves built somewhere else, shipped there, or built in a warehouse and then shipped there and constructed, or whatever air quotes manufactured means. In your opinion, will this create a condition where, in reading it, I couldn't really tell, but it felt like to me, if it had a foundation, this is a dramatic oversimplification with Keach, which I'm known for. But if it had a foundation, that's a house, period. And if it doesn't have a foundation, then that's manufactured housing or mobile housing. Do you think we'll get to the point where some of these lower cost solutions that are available will actually make it all the way down to the human being trying to buy a house, and they can get a good interest rate and all the other pieces? Or will that fall apart along the way?
No, well, I mean, one of the provisions of the bill would redefine the
single family housing, right?
Yeah, redefine it. Manufactured housing is not requiring a trailer, basically, and sort of open up GSE financing. So yes, that is part of what they're trying to achieve.
I mean, that really could unlock a fair amount of. I mean, that would instantly change the interest rate on that. Everything being the same, that person going to purchase would save multiple percentage points on their interest rate just going in the door.
No, I mean, I think it's important. And as I said, 24 votes, bipartisan, unanimous. This bill is going to get enacted into law this year. So
since I'm a really good podcaster, watch this transition. So one of the reasons that'll work is you can control it federally because it's a federal program, right? You can control what Fannie and Freddie will and won't do because that's a federal program. So many of these federal programs fall apart when you get to local, right? And the whole NIMBYism and the not in my backyard. And I mean, I think everyone to some degree is guilty of it, right? Like, I love my house and I don't know that I want a 20-unit apartment building right next door, right? Like that, or even a 20-unit condo development. I probably don't want that right next door. I don't mind if it's in town, just not next to my house, right? And if everybody feels that way, how are you ever going to get that stuff built? And like, really, are these federal programs around construction, is any of it going to have much effect if the local municipalities don't participate?
Keith doesn't hate the federal government, by the way. I just wanted to state that.
No, I don't. I'm actually blaming the local government for this. I think the federal government is trying to strip out some of the red tape, but most of the red tape is at the local level, not the federal level.
I think that's a problem that, federal policymakers recognize, right? That their leverage here is fairly limited, and they're trying to find, creative solutions to address it. As I noted, Biden, Trump, and then the Scott Warren bill that I noted, all have some form of let's use federal grant money that go to states and localities as a means of, there's an incentive mechanism, for getting them to have better land use and zoning laws. So that's kind of the main federal salvo, in that area. Interestingly, and this is kind of I think a background issue, but I think one important to highlight is that, the quote, the left, those who are, typically going to be advocating for, strong environmental, protections and other, things that might create barriers to development, increasingly recognize this phenomena that these things are leading to, supply constraints and higher housing costs, and it's getting reflected in subtle but important ways. So I don't know if you're familiar with Ezra Klein, but he's kind of a prominent, sort of thought leader, influencer, generally more left leaning. He wrote a book called Abundance that's getting a lot of attention, that gets really at this central theme. Right. So this is kind of like, that's a pretty critical data point indicating that there's a movement in this direction, and recognizing this on the left, which could manifest itself, in these more left leaning municipalities. Governor Newsom, who has, say whatever you will about him, but he definitely has his finger on the pulse of politics. He has, I think, full initiative around this issue area. So withholding state funds from, municipalities that are imposing, inappropriate costs, other regulatory actions. You may be more familiar with it than I am, in California, but I'm just noting that as somebody.
Well, he's going to make a run for president, so he needs to figure out how to get himself to be looked at as a more centered politician. Not saying that he doesn't doing it for the right reasons too, but California's got those real issues, and there's definitely some movement. Actually, just politically, you've seen quite a few parts of California, it's typically left-leaning, get far more centered on these issues because it's not resonating with anyone without solving it. So
here's what I heard. John said he could get Ezra Klein on the pod, so I appreciate that, John. Thank you. Let's pretend you were king for a day. I know we don't do kings here, but you were king for a day, and you could do whatever you wanted, state, local, federal, to solve the housing affordability / supply issue. What would John Duncan do?
Well, I'll maybe give you a little bit more kind of nuanced answer to that, which is, I think we've talked about like the policy agenda, right? And I think policymakers sort of recognize what the problem is, and what the possible solutions are. I think the issue is really more one of, you could call it political will, or you could call it kind of attractiveness of doing these things, right? Vis-a-vis, like the state and local level, for example, the other the other forces they're faced with, right? Which is, sort of activists and others that don't want to have these requirements diluted. And so I think if I, was able to do anything, it would be to, kind of articulate how, these deregulatory policies at state and local level are good politics, and get more state and local officials to recognize that. And I'd say, a promising data point in that direction is, you probably saw in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, this article about New Rochelle. They're taking steps in this direction, and the local officials are getting some credit for it, right? So I think just sort of highlighting those success stories, would probably be, kind of the main thing that I'd want to do strategically.
Two questions. Yeah, 'cause I want to make sure we get these in before time. Keith will wrap with the last one. I have one around policy changes for credit reports.
Sure.
So can you unpack that for us? Give us some of the ramifications, good and bad, you see from these potential changes that are, that are being talked about.
Well, I mean, so, what you're referring to, I guess, is that back in 2018, there was a law that was passed. It had some crazy name, but everybody just calls it S-2155. Really wonky
That's a much
stuff.
less crazy name.
I know, but it's kind of like any normal person would be like,
they need a marketing department to help them.
Yeah, exactly. Congress sometimes isn't the greatest at marketing, but anyway, but it sort of had a provision that required credit reports to be modernized, and two things sort of flowed from that. One was to create more, options for using alternative data, to determine, credit rating. So this is Advantage Score. And, that is also viewed as a important source of competition for FICO. And so the hope is that, that will be a contributor, to cost going down, because FICO now is faced with competition. That was proposed under the Biden administration as a way to fulfill this legal requirement from 2018. Just recently, Bill Pulte, the FHFA director under Trump, backed that, approved it. So I guess I'm telling this audience something it already knows, but I think the one thing that they, that Pulte has sort of signaled that he's not going to do, but is sort of, I think, still out there, is this notion of moving from a tri-merge to a bi-merge, which, the audience I'm sure is familiar with, lenders having to pull not 3 credit reports, but, 2. Industry has really pushed back strongly against that. Is not just the credit bureaus, but lenders, MBA, saying, it's just too complicated and not something they like. Pulte has basically said he suspended it, but, he still said, I'm concerned about, sort of the credit bureaus. So I think there's a little bit of uncertainty that still remains on that issue. But I mean, this is just sort of an example of where the Trump administration, is willing to kind of put sort of cost to consumers maybe ahead of some industry concerns, given the pushback that they faced on the Vantage Score issue. And then, the uncertainty that still lingers around the bi-merge.
And this is the same bill, I think, or maybe it's not a bill. My functional knowledge of working government is quite low, but medical collections were taken off, right? Not reported, I think. Was that the same thing? And then buy now, pay later was added in as a way to help people establish credit. Is that all in the same bucket, or
that's all. These are all kind of like policy decisions that the regulator, FHFA under Pulte, can, weigh in on, and that he dictates, what the GSEs do.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Whew, John, you have covered a lot of ground. We end every podcast with this question, and then sometimes it turns into 3 to 4 more, but we'll see what happens. If you were a residential real estate professional, whether it was an agent or brokerage or 2 guys running a franchise operation on a day-to-day basis, what's the one thing you'd implement today to help your business?
Well, maybe this is kind of a cop-out answer from me, given the way
we like those. Those are fun.
Where I approach things. But I would say, be informed and be active, right? Because is sort of, I guess the key theme here is there's a lot of volatility, and that's, kind of to my point on the big picture factors, that's not going to change, right? In many ways, maybe it's just going to accelerate. So I think being informed through, resources like this is one, the way to do that. And then be engaged because, policymakers need to understand that there are answers out there. As we discussed, there's a lot of smart policy that could be implemented. It's just a question of, do policymakers have the will to do it? So I'd say, investments in advocacy. This is not a commercial because we don't do that, by the way. But
John, can I jump in here because we have, well, this, the National Association of Realtors is an incredibly powerful. We have people that complain about the $60 or whatever the hell the number is they got to pay every year to be part of NAR. And I'm like, you've been in DC politics. If you're not at the table, like if we didn't have the National Association of Realtors, would policy look anything close to what it is today, in your opinion?
No, I don't think so at all. I think that's a really important institution for the industry, as are other trade associations, I think there would be a totally different outcome if there was an industry advocacy. You'd see a lot more focus on things like price controls. You'd see, a much heavier, regulatory hand. So yes, being involved has a tangible economic, business impact.
Yeah.
I appreciate the speak out and get involved part. I say this a lot too, where I'm like, we've got to be more vocal about issues and make sure people hear these issues, because otherwise the narrative's been controlled by someone else. So appreciate you.
Yeah, John.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. Really interesting things, important issues. So I appreciate the chance to join you.
It's really good details on stuff that most of us aren't getting that granular on. So we appreciate you being on the pod.
Yeah. If someone wants to learn more or follow, maybe we can get your social handles. We'll put them in the show notes. And if they want more John Duncan in their life, we'll help them figure out how to find you. Okay.
All right. Super. Thanks so much.
Appreciate
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.
Don't be left in the dark. Subscribe and leave us a comment. Unless it's bad. We hate being judged. Actually, go ahead. Leave a bad comment. Doesn't bother me.